Rick Scott, the former governor of Florida and is now my senator from Florida, is one of the most brazenly corrupt politicians in the United States. Donald Trump tapped Rick Scott to be one of the senators who crafted the Republicans' replacement to the Affordable Care Act earlier this year. I'll explain why this is completely ludicrous in a little bit. But a month ago, he did an interview on CBS where he said some really stupid shit about Medicare for All and got almost no pushback from the host. This is the first stupid thing he said in the interview. Quote, "We do know that Medicare for All, which Senator Sanders is all in on, is going to just ruin our healthcare system." Really, Rick? Do we know that? This is one of those instances where a Republican can just make shit up and speak their own backwards opinion as if it's fact. And because of this false neutrality bias that is so prevalent in mainstream media, the host won't even just come out and say, whoa, hold up. There is all of this overwhelming data and studies and research and evidence that's been collected over the course of decades that comes to the exact opposite conclusion of what you're saying. So it's not a fact that we know Medicare for All would ruin the entire healthcare system. In fact, we know the opposite is true. Instead of that, her neutrality bias and fake objectivity makes her just sit there and say nothing because, hey, Democrats and progressives have all of this evidence gathered over years that has required thousands and thousands of hours of research. And they say one thing, but this Republican with no facts, no evidence, or any sound logic behind his statement says the opposite. So I'm just going to act like they're both equal and opposite positions. Then I'll stay out of this and let the viewers decide who's telling the truth because I'm objective. So unlike this dunce, let me counter Rick Scott's assertion with actual facts. The US consistently ranks as one of the worst among the other modern nations in the category of healthcare. There are several reasons for this, one of which is healthcare is insanely expensive here in the US. There are millions and millions of people who have no care at all. I believe the number's around, 35 million now? Closer to 40 million? Around 40,000 people die every single year because they cannot afford basic healthcare in the United States. The market that our healthcare system is based on is volatile and full of instability because the health insurance companies get to write the rules and change them whenever they want, and they also get to raise prices whenever they want. And all of these things happen because we have these health insurance companies who run the entire healthcare system. And their main goal is not providing adequate, necessary healthcare for all Americans. Their main goal is how can I and my company make the most money from exploiting sick people? So what would Medicare for All do to address these problems? A study funded by the far-right libertarian Koch brothers found that if the US were to transfer to a Medicare for All system, over the course of 10 years, it would cost $2 trillion less than if we stayed with this private health insurance system that we have now. There are other studies that have estimated that number would be even higher, around $4 to $5 trillion worth of savings over the course of 10 years. Right off the bat, Medicare for All costs less. Medicare for All would cover every single citizen in this country. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. No exceptions. Right now, we have around 35 million people with absolutely no health insurance in this country. Medicare for All makes that number 0. I mentioned earlier that one of the reasons why we're ranked so low among other modern countries in the category of healthcare is because we have 40,000 people dying every year in this country unnecessarily because they can't afford basic healthcare. That's 40,000 more people than who die in France or the UK or Australia or Germany or Italy or Canada from the same issue. It's not because they have less people dying from the same problem in their country. They literally have 0 people dying in all of those countries combined because they all have access to healthcare that is funded by the government. If we had Medicare for All in the United States, it would take that number from 40,000 people dying unnecessarily every year to 0. And one final point on this. All of those things are possible because we'd have government funding everybody's healthcare. so he can cut out the private health insurance companies whose main goal is to extort and exploit sick people in this country so that they can make billions of dollars in profit. So I just proved in very little time that Rick Scott's position on this is just dead wrong. But he continues, and just a little bit further into the interview, he unintentionally exposes his real reasons for arguing against Medicare for all. He says, quote, "It's going to ruin Medicare, and it's also going to ruin private insurance." Now we know Rick Scott and Republicans don't give a fuck about ruining Medicare. In Donald Trump's budget, he proposed $800 billion in cuts to Medicare and Social Security. I guarantee that would ruin Medicare. Was Rick Scott up in arms, taking on the White House over Medicare cuts? No, he wasn't. And if it ever came to a vote in the Senate, I guarantee he would vote with Donald Trump to cut $800 billion from Medicare and Social Security. What he's really concerned about is that last part where he says Medicare for all would ruin the private health insurance industry. Now, this is getting into why I said earlier, it is entirely ludicrous to have someone like Rick Scott drafting any kind of healthcare legislation for the country. Rick Scott was the CEO of the largest health insurance company in the US. He was at the top of the heap of these gross health insurance companies exploiting Americans for profit. The company that he was running did it more than anyone else, and he made millions of dollars doing it. That right there alone is a giant conflict of interest that should immediately disqualify him from being anywhere near the discussion of healthcare reform in the United States. But there's more. Rick Scott wasn't content with being the CEO of the largest health insurance company in the country and ripping off millions of people in any of the many legal ways that health insurance companies are allowed to in the United States. While he was an executive at that company, Rick Scott committed the largest Medicare fraud in the history of the United States. His company committed fraud on such a massive scale that the company had to plead guilty to 14 different felonies and a record fine of $1.7 billion for fraud. So again, Rick Scott can spare me his fucking crocodile tears about how Medicare for all is going to ruin Medicare, because bitch, you defrauded Medicare at a historic level, an epic level that nobody in this country has ever reached before. So you're the last person to pretend like you care about Medicare. All he cares about is protecting the industry that gave him his fortune, and that he will gladly go and lobby for the second he's out of the Senate. I fucking guarantee it. Mark my words, the day Rick Scott is done being a United States Senator, he will go and lobby for the private health insurance industry, if not just go on the board of one of those companies. So you know how there's this ongoing discussion about whether or not some conservatives actually believe the stupid shit that they're saying, and others are just corrupt, and some are just a mix of both. Rick Scott is one of the clearest cases of someone not being naive or ignorant. Rick Scott is just insanely corrupt. And he's a fucking liar who will go out and make complete bullshit, disingenuous arguments against Medicare for all because it's in his own personal self-interest to keep the private health insurance industry intact. His objections to Medicare for all have nothing to do with whether or not it would help hundreds of millions of Americans in the country. All he's concerned about is protecting his own bottom line. And it's amazing how this host doesn't bring any of this up while they're having a discussion about healthcare reform, where it would be a little relevant for the audience to know this information about Rick Scott. This was one of the worst displays of journalism I've seen in a very long time. But I want to make one final point about the epic hypocrisy from the Republican Party and Rick Scott. What are the two main reasons that conservatives give for wanting to cut Medicare, Medicaid, and other social programs? The first is when they want to pretend like they're deficit hawks and they care about the national debt and deficit. When we all know that they don't, it's just bullshit because they run up the debt and deficit more than anyone else. But the second is waste, fraud, and abuse. They always give these high-minded rationalizations about how they need to cut these programs because they can't, in good faith, put taxpayer money into programs where there's a possibility of waste, fraud, and abuse. So now, isn't it ironic that the person that Donald Trump and the Republican Party has enlisted to come up with healthcare reform for the entire country is the same person who pleaded guilty to 14 felonies relating to the biggest Medicare fraud in the history of the United States? This is yet another example of what myself and many more prominent left-wing voices in politics have been saying about the Republican Party for years. All they are is a front for corporate America. They are a collection of pirates and bandits and fucking marauders whose main goal above everything else is to steal as much money as possible from working class and poor Americans in order to make themselves even more rich. And the issue of healthcare is no exception.